So my name is Matt Taylor, and I'm the Protestant scholar here at ICJS. For those who have never done anything with us before, ICJS stands for the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. We're in Baltimore. I know we have people joining us from all over the country, perhaps all over the world, but we're located in Baltimore. And we are an interreligious and interfaith institute. We have scholars on staff who do scholarship around interfaith and interreligious studies, but we do a lot of programs that are focused on helping the general public, helping particular communities of people think about how do we live in this religiously plural world? And how do we work with the religious diversity that exists here, especially in the United States? So welcome. We're glad that you are joining us this evening. We're going to do some quick introductions with my co-facilitators, and then we're going to send you into breakout rooms to introduce yourselves. We're actually going to have several different times tonight where you'll be in breakout rooms, interacting with each other and getting a chance to know each other. So as I said, my name is Matt Taylor, and my title is Protestant Scholar. My specialization here is especially in Muslim-Christian dialogue and in forms of Christian extremism. And so let me pass it off to my co-facilitators here. Halla, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Hello, everybody. I'm happy to see you all. Thank you for joining us. My name is Halla Attallah, and I'm the visiting Muslim scholar. I worked with ICJS back between 2019 and 2020, and I'm very happy to be back with you all. So I specialize in the Quran and Quranic stories. I'm very interested in how the Quran sort of engages in stories to kind of communicate its sort of religious worldview. Otherwise, I live in DC with my partner, Mike, my rambunctious 6-year-old, and a brand new puppy named Rosie.
And Ben, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, everyone. I am Ben Sachs. I'm the Jewish scholar here at ICJS. This is my 9th year at the Institute, which I'm very excited to say. It's the longest I've ever worked anywhere. My specialization is German Jewish intellectual history, focusing primarily on philosophy of language and mysticism. But my day job is in dialogue, and I'm very interested in how we think about and do dialogue together in the many ways into interreligious conversations, including tonight. And I very much look forward to getting to know everyone on the call tonight. Maybe not everyone, but as many as I can.
He's excited to get to know all that he can. He wasn't signaling that he's not excited about anyone in particular.
If I don't get to know you tonight, it's not you, it's me.
We're going to keep you all on mute while we're in this general session. And then once you're in your breakout rooms, you'll be able to talk and interact with each other. And we have facilitators who will be in those rooms with you, who will help facilitate conversation in those groups. So we're going to give a few introductory comments before we go into our breakout rooms, just to set the tone for this course as a whole. If you joined this course because you wanted to get a deep history of the Crusades, you joined the wrong course, and you're welcome to exit at any point. But this will not be a history of the Crusades. We'll give a little bit of historical background. We'll kind of fill in some of the gaps, perhaps, in maybe your own reckoning with the Crusades. We'll definitely be doing some history, but most of our focus is in the present moment, in the way that we imagine the Crusades, the way that the Crusades have structured our imaginings of other religious communities, and the ways that that affects the conversations that we get to have in the present. And if we're going to hopefully try to think around, are there ways we can think past the Crusades over the course of our 4 sessions together? So this is more about dialogue in the present moment than about history. So you'll get a little bit of history, but it's also about the structure of our imaginations. Let me share a slideshow with us here that will take us through the session tonight. And give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Okay, great. So we titled this course, The Crusades, Are We Prisoners of Our Interreligious History? And especially by that we mean, are we prisoners in our imaginations of our interreligious history? Do the Crusades, for good, or we will really argue for ill, structure the way that we think about each other, the way that we interact with each other in the present, the way that we even imagine the shape of the world. So let me lay out, and I'll have Ben and Halla jump in here at different points as well, some of our premises, our basic assumptions as we come into this course as instructors, as we have been planning and preparing for this. So the first is that, as I said, the Crusades have structured our interreligious imaginations. We still live in the world of the Crusades in many ways, and we'll explore that some tonight. How do we still, both in our culture, in our pop culture, in our interreligious interactions, in our imaginings of each other, how do we still live in that world of the Crusades? How has this happened? Why has this happened? And how does this measure against the actual history? Is the memory, the collective cultural memory that we have of the Crusades, an accurate one? Or are the various memories that each of our religious traditions retain of the Crusades, are those accurate? And we'll try to do some of that historical work, but also try to work within our own imaginations over the course of our 4 weeks together. We also want to talk about the Crusades, this period in history, the events that are called the Crusades produce divergent narratives in our religious traditions. They're remembered differently. And so we'll talk about a few of these memories in very broad terms here. One of the things that is a very important part of history is that there didn't really exist, prior to the Crusades, there didn't really exist such a concept as Europe. It was not really a thing. There were a lot of different kingdoms, a lot of different fiefdoms, a lot of different feudal domains, but the Crusades in many ways invent the identity of Europe, what we sometimes also call the West, right? That conception of this unified continent of all these groups of people, that unity in many ways comes through the violence and the shared endeavor of the Crusades. And that becomes then the roots of what is called the Clash of Civilizations narrative. We'll talk more about that over the course of this evening, and especially in our 4th session together. But even the idea of civilization, the idea of a Western civilization, the idea of a European civilization, of which for some reason the United States seems to participate, even though we're geographically removed, that really comes out of the 11th and 12th centuries in the Crusades. Those are the first moments where you start to see people speaking in those kind of terms. Now, what we also want to talk about the different imaginations of the Crusades that inhabit our religious traditions. So I'll let Halla speak to what is, if you had to put it in 1 to 2 sentences, what is the Muslim imagination of the Crusades?
Really quickly, I mean, there's not much of an imagination. So it's not only conceptualized different, in many ways, you can argue that there's no concept at all. Really, prior, especially to the 18th or 19th century, this concept wasn't there. It wasn't until colonialism and then with globalization that becomes an idea in certain Muslim groups. But again, part of what we want to emphasize is it's just not imagined in the same way, and it's not as significant, or it's framed differently.
I'll speak to the Christian imagination, and we'll see this as we get into some of our pop culture conversations. But I would say, if you're trying to give a broad statement about the Christian imagination of the Crusades, I would say Jesus was a meek and mild man who provoked people and died at the hands of empire without resisting. But for some reason, Jesus needs some of his followers to go up and beat the crap out of some people sometimes. That is the imagination of the Crusades. And every time you hear Christians positively invoking the Crusades, it means violence under the symbol of the cross. Ben, how would you articulate the Jewish imagination standing on one foot?
So the way Jews imagine the Crusades actually comes out of the Hebrew Chronicles that document what were happening to these communities, and they actually are in concert with what the Latin narratives say. They were massacres. It was really one of the first times on a mass scale that we saw the charge of deicide, the idea that Jews killed Jesus, transformed into violence. And we'll talk about this in the 3rd session, sacred violence. Tens of thousands of Jews are murdered. And the Crusaders themselves are confused as to whether or not the Crusades should be solely against Muslims were also Jews. And it was more convenient, since Jews lived in European lands, to kill them. And so in the Jewish imagination, what we have are the sounds and the emotions associated with watching and hearing friends and family be murdered while people say religious slogans. And honestly, not always knowing why this is happening, because the passing of information was rather sparse. So from the Jewish point of view, the Crusades come with an incredible sense of violence.
So those are four of the imaginations, or four of the narratives that come out of the Crusades. And we would like to make the case that all of these narratives are poison in interreligious dialogue. All four of these narratives, the clash of civilizations, and each of these memories that we have of the Crusades poison our interreligious conversations. And so can we learn to think in different ways? Do the Crusades have to be representative of all of the relations amongst Jews and Christians and Muslims? Or can we think in other ways? So here's what we're going to do. We are going to send you into breakout rooms, and you are going to answer these questions. All right. You're going to first introduce yourself. You're going to go around the room, introduce yourselves, talk about what is your religious or non-religious background. So how are you coming into this? And feel free to be as nuanced as you want in that. And then just after you've introduced yourself and talked about your own background, what are 2 or 3 images or phrases that come to mind when you hear the phrase the Crusades? Right. So introduce who you are, religious or non-religious background, 2 or 3 images that come to mind. We're going to go for about 10 minutes into our breakout rooms and then come back and we'll start the lesson. Well, welcome back. I think we have everyone back now. So hopefully that was a good time in your breakout rooms. We will have more time in your breakout rooms. So if that felt like it was entirely too brief, don't worry, you'll get sent back in there shortly. So we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to spend the first half of our time thinking a little bit about pop culture and how pop culture imagines or reimagines the Crusades over and over and over again. And then we'll have some time to discuss that. And then we'll start thinking about some of the more dark legacies as well. So let's see. I get to go first, and we're gonna take turns here. So I grew up in the evangelical world in Southern California, where crusade was not a bad word. People in my world valorized and lionized Billy Graham. I mean, Billy Graham was seen as the icon of evangelicalism. One of the great historians of evangelicalism who I studied under, George Marsden, once defined an evangelical as somebody who likes Billy Graham. Billy Graham was the unifying figure at the heart of American evangelicalism for the latter half of the 20th century. And Billy Graham, of course, called his major evangelistic events the Billy Graham Crusades. And I have been to a Billy Graham crusade. I can't say that I gave my heart to Jesus there. It had already been given to him. But these were major unifying events for evangelicals, were these Billy Graham crusades. One of the major campus ministries that comes out of evangelicalism is called Campus Crusade for Christ. I remember in college attending Campus Crusade for Christ meetings. I ultimately went with a different Christian fellowship, but this was, again, this was not seen as beyond the pale or awful. And this is the early 2000s when I'm in college, and seemingly it's okay to have Campus Crusade for Christ. They have since come to recognize that that's not the most great title for an organization. So they now call themselves CRU, C-R-U, which to me is very strange as well, because they're still shortening the word that gives the offense. It'd be like saying, well, Hitler Youth is a really bad term, so let's just call it HIT, right? Like there's something still very wrong about just simply shortening the word, but still keeping the reference. And then the image that you see at the bottom right of your screen was actually my high school mascot. I went to an evangelical Christian school, Village Christian Schools, and our mascot was the Crusaders. And so I went to sporting events cheering for the Crusaders. Our cheerleaders were cheering for the Crusaders, right? And this is, again, in the late 1990s. This was not kind of in some bygone era, but it was still very acceptable to think of the Crusades as this entirely positive image of Christianity. All right, I think Ben's up.
So I want to start by setting up a section of the movie, The Da Vinci Code. And the reason why this movie is, I think, important for tonight's conversation is that the idea of a secret society, or the idea that the world is illusory and that there is some secret essence that needs to be mined by the virtuous, sort of a noble decoding, plays a role in our imagination when we think about the Crusades, because ultimately there's a redemptive aspect going on in that the violence, the irrationality, and the suffering that goes on. We want a reason that's simply beyond just conquering, and we want to redeem some aspects of it. And we'll talk about this again on the third class. The idea that some of us do justify all sorts of violence with our imaginations. But what's interesting here is that, at least interesting to me, is that there's a power structure at play, that Christianity is being represented by a nefarious elite, and that they're suppressing an inner truth that can liberate Christians all over the world, and that this truth was kept hidden from the Middle Ages, and from the time of the Crusades. So I want to share this clip with you. What's interesting about this clip, there are many things that are interesting about it, but for the sake of time, it's that the church during the Crusades is ultimately hiding the fact that Jesus had a child with Mary.
Oh, Ben, don't give it away. Sorry.
It's still going to be a mediocre movie, whether you know the ending or not. but this idea that it's an intra-Christian problem, and that there is a liberative aspect to this potential violence. I'm sorry if I gave it away, but
all right, Halla, I think you're up.
I am. Let me see. So I would like to talk about this documentary called The Sultan and the Saint, which was released in 2017. And it explores the encounter between Saint Francis of Assisi and the Egyptian Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil at a battlefield in Damietta in 1219. So at the height, or what was kind of narrated at the height of the Crusades, and this is an example of a peaceful encounter. Before saying more, we'll go ahead and play the clip. All right, that is the perfect time to stop there. So just to kind of give you a little taste of this documentary, the film is basically interested in promoting interfaith understanding and a message of peace by portraying or presenting a scenario whereby you have these two important, very faithful figures, Christian and Muslim, who come together during the Crusades. So even during the Crusades, sort of the height of Muslim-Christian conflict, you get this meaningful ecumenical exchange. So what's sort of interesting to keep in mind, while a lot of other sources emphasize kind of this otherness when we're thinking about Muslims, here there's this sort of idealization, and I think some would argue over idealization of sort of this Muslim Christian understanding. And just to kind of give you a little bit more background, this particular encounter had been documented by Christian thinkers for centuries in both writing and in art. Even more recently, you have in this depiction right here on the right, by the Franciscan friar Robert Lentz, who portrays both the saint, Francis of Assisi, and the Sultan in a very reverential way. Both of them have, you'll notice the flames around them, which you will see in a lot of Muslim art as a sign of holiness, and also the halos. So kind of this very idealized imagery. And finally, I'll conclude by saying, just to let you know, in Muslim thought, this encounter is not recorded. I remember back in the day when Matt and I did research on this, we couldn't find anything in the history of Muslim thought. And even the Sultan, al-Malik, occupies just maybe a few pages in Islamic history.
Yeah. So while Bonnie Good King England is off fighting his great crusade, that scoundrel Prince John is here oppressing the people of England, right? And this is the narrative of the Robin Hood legend, the Robin Hood myth, right? Prince John is the bad guy because he's too cowardly or too greedy to go off and fight in a great crusade. And yet how much is he really the villain in history? Isn't Richard the Lionheart the one who crosses a continent to go slaughter people? And Prince John is at home governing. And yet in our mythology, in our storytelling, we always remember it a particular way. All right. And I think, Ben, you're up.
And so we don't need the clip. But essentially this movie is trying to recreate aspects of the Crusade, and what Ridley Scott was either criticized or hailed for doing was to show that violence doesn't solve anything. But he represents the Crusaders as thoughtless barbarians and Muslims as cultured. And he creates a dichotomy in how they fight and how they try to understand one another. The main point that I think we should take away, at least from these few seconds, is where the protagonists, Saladin and Balin, the Christian protagonist, both agree that it's probably better to destroy Jerusalem so that people will stop fighting over it. And I think what's important about that statement is the assumption that Jerusalem is this eternally fraught city, that people have been fighting over it for millennia, that there have been wars that were fought 3,000 years ago to the present, and that current conflicts somehow have a deeper connection to the past, regardless of what's actually been happening in Jerusalem for the last 1,500 years. And so I think what's important about that is the association of Jerusalem with violence and sacred violence.
Right. By the way, we're not necessarily recommending any of these films, in case you haven't noticed. Halla, I think you're up.
Okay. So one of the very few references that I was able to locate from a Muslim / Arab pop culture is from a Saudi satire called Tash Matash, which is slang for whatever goes, or no big deal, or whatever. So I grew up in Saudi Arabia, so I was very excited to find this. And so this show, kind of like The Simpsons, is sort of a parody on culture and life in Saudi. And in this one particular skit, a guy and his uncle, who you can kind of see here on the bottom right, accidentally travel back in time to the 12th century, and they meet Saladin and one of the members of his court. So at first, they're very confused about who these people are. Even after Saladin introduces himself, the younger guy will turn to his uncle and he says something along the lines of, I think they told us about this guy in high school. I'm not sure. And then Saladin asks them, who are you and from what era do you come from? And so they tell him, we are Arabs from, 14 such and such of the Hijra, which is the Muslim calendar. And then Saladin, all excited, gets up and he says, you are Arabs from the future? Tell me about our civilization, and he anxiously awaits for them to answer. They basically respond by saying, oh, your so-called Andalus or Spain is gone, but we're better off now. We have televisions with many channels, cars, and air conditioning that blows in your face all day. So what's interesting about this, I think, for the purposes of our discussion today, is it's not only a commentary on Saudi materialism, but it's really emphasizing that this is just not that significant at all to most people within that context. This isn't something that many Muslim Arabs are thinking about all the time. And then the other thing I wanted to point out that I found kind of interesting about it is the language and the imagery of the Crusades itself, and the way it's been framed in the other pop culture references is just not there. It's absent. It's not existent. There's no explicit reference to it.
So I get the next one. So anyone here who isn't a gamer might not have heard of Assassin's Creed, but this is one of the premier video game franchises on the market today. And in the Assassin's Creed video game series, I've played a couple of them. It's an open world. You wander around these open worlds, and the premise of the whole thing is you can your character time travels back in time and can inhabit the memories of his ancestors. And so the first part of this video game series, the first of the games, I think there's like 10 or 11 of them now. But the first one, you actually go back into the Third Crusade and inhabit the memories of your ancestor, who was one of the assassins, one of the Hashashim, who were this legendary kind of Muslim group of warriors. And the whole concept of Assassin's Creed is kind of the inverse, in some ways, of the Da Vinci Code. In this narrative, the Knights Templar control the world throughout history and are this secret society that is controlling everything. And so you get to go around assassinating Knights Templar and slaughtering them in this kind of open world and fighting against them and destroying their strategies, right? So it's, again, taking that imagery of the Crusades, and the imagery from the game is incredible. You can see you can explore all over ancient Jerusalem while you're slaughtering these Knights Templar. And I think Ben has our final one before we go to our breakout rooms.
I don't know that this needs much commentary, but if you remember, there was the controversy at this year's World Cup that British fans were not allowed to wear their Crusader costumes or anything that was honoring their patron St. George, or walk in with plastic swords or shields, because the idea of Crusaders coming to the Middle East to cheer on foreign potential conquerors doesn't usually lead to good things. And so the controversy was that they were banned from wearing this. And so this becomes an issue of, well, they're denying us of our culture, of our heritage, of our identity, and that the hosts need to better understand who we are, so that we can truly celebrate this game together. The clip is hilarious, but we could save that for another day.
We can also send it out in the email. You can find a number of clips online of very angry and perturbed British people complaining about how utterly unfair it was that the Qatari government wouldn't let them wear their Crusader outfits in Qatar. So we're going to go into our breakout rooms again. And here are the questions that we want you to discuss. Why do we still live with the Crusades template? Why do we still carry these memories? Why do these things keep resurfacing in our cultural imaginations? And why does the Crusade era inhabit our cultural imagination the way that it does? Why do we keep kind of chewing over these events, these characters, this period in history? My colleague Katie has put in some rules, some discussion guidelines for our breakout rooms. I'm just going to read them really quick, just as a reminder for those who've been here before and as guidance for those who are new here. We value everyone's voices, so please speak up and allow space for others to do the same. Speak from your own experiences. Don't try to tell someone else's story. We're going to honor the privacy of each other, but we'll be able to take lessons from each other. Listen to learn, not to respond. Remember that we all come from different identities and backgrounds, so please expect a difference of perspective. Respect others' rights to have opinions and views that differ from your own. Don't invalidate others' experiences. In order to promote an open, honest exchange, please respect confidentiality within the small group. Identifying stories should stay, but lessons can leave. You can talk about the lessons you learned without necessarily telling someone else's story. And then this is a learning space. So ask questions and feel free to participate, even if you don't have all the answers. So we're going to go back into our breakout rooms for another 10 minutes or so to try to talk about why do we still live with this Crusades template, and why does the Crusade era inhabit our cultural imagination in the way that it does. Welcome back. It looks like everyone has rejoined us here. We will have one more breakout session. So hold that final thought that you were sharing, and we'll have space for it. We're going to give a content warning for this next section and just say we tried to keep the light and somewhat funny parts of the Crusades and our cultural memory of it in the first part. Some of what we're going to talk about and look at now is potentially a little more disturbing. So fair warning, and we understand if not everyone can fully engage with everything, okay? So coming back to our slideshow. Let's see, I think Halla, you're up first here.
Aha, I am Samuel Huntington. So we were going to begin by talking about this individual, Samuel Huntington, and this theory that he develops called Clash of Civilizations, which really comes to serve as kind of another paradigm that sort of embodies the Crusade, in which foreign policy is at times thought through. So Samuel Huntington, who died in 2008, was a professor of political science at Harvard University, where he was also the director of international affairs. During the Carter administration, he worked as the coordinator of security planning for the National Security Council. And after that, he served in the 80s as the advisor to the Civil War Bureau in South Africa during the apartheid period. So here's an individual who is quite influential in both the academic and the political sphere, especially as it pertains to foreign affairs. So Samuel Huntington is best known for an article that he published in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1993 called Clash of Civilizations, ? And he later expands on this article into a book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order, which you can see here pictured below. So the basic premise of a clash of civilizations, or the thesis, is that world conflicts will no longer be about resources, for example, but they will be based on cultural and religious identities or differences. And in his organization, right, his schemata of world civilizations, and more specifically civilizations that are in conflict, he singles out Muslims, positing this group as inherently in opposition to the Western values, and so forth. So here are some quotes by Huntington that I wanted to talk about. The top here is from Foreign Affairs in the blue. The first one, conflict along the fault line between Western and Islamic civilizations has been going on for 1,300 years. So here we find Huntington evoking a Crusader-related trope that Muslims and Christians have basically been in conflict since the beginning, 1,300 years, which is more or less when Islam came to be. So basically maintaining that this conflict is due to Islam or Muslimness as an existence. And then the second quote, the crescent-shaped Islamic bloc from the Bulge of Africa to Central Asia has bloody borders. So in this quote, he connects this historical memory, right, of a 1,300-year conflict to geography. And then this idea of a nation state, stating that nations that are majority Muslims have bloody borders. And he repeats this quote later in the article, Islam has bloody borders. He emphasizes this point. And this quote he later expands in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. Islam's borders are bloody, and so are its innards. So in other words, Islam and Muslims, whether in relation to others or with themselves, are essentially violent. And this violence is connected to a religious identity. So here we have an example of the Crusades tropes or template making its way into Samuel Huntington's very academic, very influential articles.
So Huntington's book comes out, the Clash of Civilizations, the book version comes out in 1996. And 5 years later, you have 9/11. And after 9/11, George W. Bush is giving kind of off-the-cuff press remarks on the White House lawn. This is on, I believe this is on the 13th, so 2 days after 9/11. And this is what he said. So the crusade, right, against evildoers, these barbarians whose brutality we could not have imagined, right? This is the rhetoric. And the White House press office tried to go and clean these remarks up afterwards. Oh, he didn't really mean crusade. That just slipped out. But people took notice, right? And even if you think about what comes out of that conversation, the axis of evil speech, right? This alignment. We are on the side of good, we are the righteous warriors, and we are battling evil itself. I think, Halla, you're up next.
Yes. And so one of the people who did take notice of George W. Bush's speech was Osama bin Laden. And so he, I think in 2002, November of 2002, sends a letter to Al Jazeera. And this is, an instance where you do find the language and the violence underlying the crusade sort of appearing in a discourse from a Muslim actor. So let's see, here are some quotes that I have from the letter that I would like to talk about. So after American politicians had spoken, the American newspapers and television channels overflowed with evident Crusader hatred in this campaign against Islam and its people. Bush left no room for doubts or media opinion. He stated clearly that this was typo. This was a Crusader war. He said this in front of the whole world so as to emphasize this fact, and I apologize for the typos in here. And then the second quote, look at this war that began some days ago against Afghanistan. It is a single unrelated event. Or is it part of a long series of Crusader wars against the Islamic world? Since World War I, which ended over 83 years ago, the entire Islamic world has fallen under the Crusader banners, under the British, the French, and Italian governments. So what's really interesting here is that he directly engages with the rhetoric of George W. Bush, wielding this imagery and inverting it, right? It is about Christian and Western aggressors whom, according to bin Laden, hate and want to destroy Muslims and Islam. And then the other thing that's interesting is he evokes this template of the Crusade quite explicitly, but he links it to Muslim memories of the West. He links it to colonialism. So you see here, and in the end, he immediately links it to World War I. the British, the French, and Italian governments. So these are situations or memories that are important in the Muslim and Arab world. So here you have the Crusades being inverted, but still in this, in the service of violence.
Ben?
So I want to be quick again, just for the sake of time. But if you remember when the Notre Dame Cathedral was burning, conservative commentator Ben Shapiro tweeted that this was a fire on the cathedral of Judeo-Christian civilization. And so this inspired a great deal of debate. And so I chose to share the headline of the English version of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, where the opinion piece is that Ben Shapiro glorifies Judeo-Christian values, absolves its anti-Semitism, and preaches its Islamophobia. The argument was that when Notre Dame Cathedral was built in France, Jews weren't even allowed to be there. And the history of violence against Jews in France over 900 years spans from not just the Crusades, but covers 200 or 300 years of violence as a result of blood libels, all the way to the Damascus affair in some of the French colonies accusing Jews of blood libel, to the Dreyfus affair. So to suggest that there is a Judeo in the Christian values seems a bit odd, given that France, for the history of French-speaking lands, we're not very kind to Jewish residents, to say the least. And so the argument was that in this clash of civilization, the Judeo is going to become very important in Christian civilization, as opposed to taking sides with Islam and Muslim civilization. It's a controversy worth looking up, but for the sake of our dialogue tonight, we'll just keep it at it's an important controversy.
So a few years ago, we had Brennan Tarrant, a white supremacist, go and attack 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. He killed 51 Muslim worshippers that day across 2 different mosques. He filmed his own shooting. He had a first-person camera, making it look like a video game as he went around assassinating people. And what some people didn't note at the time were the symbols and markings on his weapons. He covered the machine guns that he used in all kinds of propaganda, rooted in the clash of civilizations narrative. And I'm going to highlight a few of the things in here just to give you some illustrations. So in both the image on the left and the 732, the Battle of Tours, and Charles Martel in the image on the right, he is invoking the effort to stop the Muslim conquests when they are going up into the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, right? This moment of conflict between quote unquote Europe and quote unquote Islam. And so Charles Martel is the leader of the Frankish military then, and the Battle of Tours is the point at which that invasion of the Iberian Peninsula is put to a stop. He also references on the bottom left that they didn't even call it out. I don't even know if the news media noticed this, but on the magazine of one of his weapons, he highlighted the Battle of Acre in 1189. This was the beginning of the Third Crusade. So Saladin had reconquered Jerusalem, had reconquered Acre, and the Third Crusade was European armies attacking Acre and laying siege to it. This was so he's invoking the Third Crusade. They wind up taking Acre and reestablishing a kingdom in the Middle East. And then on the top left, you have the Turkophagos, which is the Greek term for Turk eaters. And these were Greek militias fighting Ottoman Turks. Right. So again, a conflict between West and East, even though they're both Mediterranean, right? How is that West and East? But the Battle of Lepanto in the top left corner is a decisive Crusader victory. And the siege of Vienna in 1683, down in the bottom right corner, is when the Ottoman Empire is attempting to conquer Vienna in the 17th century. So you have throughout the references that he's making, he's constantly pointing back not only to the Crusades, but to the clash of civilizations narrative and saying, I am a warrior like those Crusader warriors, slaughtering Muslims for the sake of my civilization. January 6th, 2021, the Capitol riot. You have multiple instances of people participating in the Capitol riot carrying around Crusader flags. This flag with the red cross on it is sometimes called the Deus Vult flag, because when Pope Urban II called people to go and fight the First Crusade, according to legend, and we'll talk about this some next week, according to the legend, he preaches this sermon, says, God is calling us to reconquer the Holy Land, and the whole crowd shouts in unison, God wills it. God wills it. And so this flag, and you can even see the phrase Deus Vult in the top right corner, is saying, God wills it. God wills that we would take back America for Donald Trump and for God. God wills it that we would storm the Capitol, right? An invocation of the Crusades, people wearing Crusader crosses, holding their Bibles as they go in to attack the US Capitol. I'm going to warn you that the next image is disturbing. We're going to show it to you. Ben and Halla and I are going to offer a few observations about it. And then we're going to send you into your breakout rooms to think about it a little bit. This image that we're about to show you is a meme that is showing up right now on alt-right websites. So right-wing websites that are organizing around violence, organizing around things like January 6th, organizing around things like what we saw just this month in Brazil, kind of right-wing anti-democratic mobilization. And this is one of the memes that is populating that world right now. So just to observe, in the foreground, you have a Crusader wearing the Deus Vult cross and a Muslim soldier who are seemingly willing to reconcile as they face these hordes of left-wing activists, caricatured, who are coming towards them. Ben, Halla, do you want to offer a couple comments before we send folks into their groups?
Sure.
Oh,
go ahead, Halla.
you sure? I was just going to say really quickly, part of what's interesting to me is this assuming that there would be a potential partnership on this is really also based on stereotypes against most Muslims and Islam. You know, obviously, I don't know, the homophobia and all of that, it's also reinforcing certain stereotypes about Muslims, but there's plenty more I could say, but I will hand it over to Ben.
So we have the two civilizations, Christian and Muslim, and looking at the descent that's taking place. You see the hammer and sickle, you see stop white oppression, the LGBTQ flag, equality, and in the background you see a spider with the caricature of the Jewish face and the Jewish star. And this comes out of the second most translated book in the history of humanity, which is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The idea that Jews are behind these movements as a way of dividing people, that they're trying to uproot traditional values and replace them with atheism or egoism or debased moral behavior or things like sexual expression, equality, that behind all of these disparate movements for equal rights or for stopping oppression is a Jewish conspiracy as a way of uprooting and dividing traditional values. And this is an old trope. But what makes this meme interesting to me anyway is that we're seeing it being used as a catalyst for potential peace between two warring civilizations in a frightening way.
Okay, so we've gone a long way tonight from happy, cheerful Disney characters dancing and singing to this. But what we want you to do is go back into your breakout rooms, and here's what we want you to discuss. Try to interpret this final image together. And what does this say about how Crusades imagery has corrupted our imaginations? That this is not some ancient artifact of culture. This is right now on the internet, a meme that people are talking about and using to express their vision of the world. So let's take 5 minutes in our breakout rooms, and then we'll come back, have a quick discussion all together, and then end for the night. So 5 minutes in our breakout rooms.
Thank you for coming out. We hope that we've given you a lot of food for thought, and hopefully you'll be able to sleep. I know a number of you had talked about having nightmares tonight. Rest assured, it will get better, in the sense that at the end we want to find new ways into how we can transcend these violent mythologies. In any event, wishing you a great week and looking forward to seeing you soon.